as people shift from books and long-form reading to watching and listening a lot more in terms of how they get information. Now, some of the biggest rising stars in politics already know about this. They're meeting voters where they are on their phones, just like past politicians worked with what was the then new media, like radio or TV. That's how campaigns are adjusting. But this wider shift has implications for our politics, our society, how we understand the world around us. And U.S. schools and colleges still assign reading and books, of course, but grown adults are actually reading far less than they used to with the internet and social media shifts we know about. Daily reading by choice has fallen from what was under a third of the public to now just 16%. Rose Horowitz confronts this shift in a new, widely discussed Atlantic article on the end of reading, noting in a recent year, fewer than half of all adults reporting having reading a book of any kind. The shift spans all groups, by the way. She notes it cuts across generations, gender, education levels, retirees, women, college graduates. They've all seen, as she writes, a collapse. And so it is interesting to look around and see that we have new stuff, and we know by people's habits and choices they like it. Even people who criticize our phone-addicted world, if you ask them to show you their screen time, which most phones will show you, it's pretty high. Most people, it's higher than they like to admit. And so that's the new thing. But if it's crowding out one of the core things that we expect any informed society to know how to do, to read not only texts and little messages, but to read and think in depth, right, on a larger basis so that we can understand the larger issues around us. If we can't do that, well, that might speak to some of these very problems we have in our self-governing democracy these days. So, with that in mind, I want to turn to something special tonight. That writer, Rose Horowitz, from The Atlantic, author of that piece, joins us along with Michelle Goldberg. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Rose, do we know if anyone read your article? Just kidding. Just getting that out of the way. You took a big look at this. What did you find, and why might it matter?
Yes. So, as you were saying, I found that reading is, declining by a huge amount in America. That, the share of Americans who read a book or an article on any given day has declined by 40% over the past 2 decades. And that in 2022, fewer than half of all Americans read a book of any kind in the prior year. And I think why this matters, and what I tried to argue in the piece, is that reading is not just, one way we communicate or one technology for spreading information. It's really structures, the way that we think, our politics and our culture. And so as reading starts to decline, we can expect to see kind of society-wide changes.
Michelle, where do you see that? Because I should mention, Michelle writes and reads. I actually know that. And when we look at wider themes like misinformation, the way conspiracy theories are taking hold more, the push side of that's obviously social media, rewarding that. We've covered that. But I wonder if the audience side of that is a slightly less literate, critical thinking group. Michelle.
Yeah, look, I'm a writer, so I have a vested interest in people reading, but I still, even, if I try to look at this objectively, I do really think it is catastrophic for a liberal democratic society, because I just think we really underestimate how much of our kind of democratic habits of mind rely on being a kind of illiterate as opposed to an oral society, right? It's kind of structures, as Rose said, how you appeal to authority, how you kind of synthesize information, how you, kind of think linearly and are able to refer to history. And I also think that novels, more than maybe any other medium, are key to building empathy. I remember once reading a book by a scholar of the French Enlightenment who talked about how before the rise of novels, many aristocrats didn't actually realize that their servants had interior lives, had their own feelings. And so, which is hard to believe, but I think that, novels kind of condition us to inhabit other kinds of consciousness, and losing that is a terrible thing.
Really a deep point there. Rose, you also make an observation I think connects. People may not know the data, but it might connect with people. Certainly, I think we've got viewers who obviously follow the news, multiple mediums, read articles. But you make this point. Americans are probably reading more words than ever before, bombarded with emails, text messages, X posts, Reddit threads, Instagram captions. So you go through kind of the social media text space. And you say, quote, this explosion of textual fragments has come at the expense of sustained attention to longer written works that convey rich and complicated information. And while your piece isn't overtly politically obsessed, Rose, I wonder how you can apply that to, I think, a feeling people have, which is politics has gotten more emotional, even more sort of just throwing these bits of propagandistic words at each other, and feel a little less, perhaps, nuanced than 40 years ago.
Yeah, so what I found really interesting when I was reporting this piece was that, I was reading media theorists who wrote half a century ago, and they were actually predicting a lot of the things that we see now. They kind of predicted that there would be a return to this society that mimicked a lot of the conventions of pre-literate times, where, people would speak and contradict themselves as though there was no prior record of their words. They would kind of speak, very emotionally. They would speak, simplistically. They would use, epithets and repetition, almost in the way that these epic poets did. And I think that we see a lot of that, as I write in the piece, in the way that Donald Trump communicates. I call him the first post-literate president, and he's really understood kind of how to communicate in this post-literate world and get his message out.
Totally. And then you have sort of what's coming up in the culture, because there's always some sort of ebb and flow. I want to show something that, interestingly, we have some from TikTok, but about sort of throwbacks, analog vibes. Take a look.
What if you went into a bar, but instead of just drinks, it was full of books and cozy places to read? I don't know about you, but that's kind of my dream.
Word on the For You page is that we're going analog in 2026.
Day one of 7 books in 7 days.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm shaking. Oh my gosh, I have to go read it. Let's go.
Rose, any hope there?
Definitely. So it was fascinating. I spoke with the head of Cleveland's public library, and he was talking about how young people are really aligned with, the older generation that goes, and that they prefer print books. It seems to be this kind of backlash against, an age where everything is digital and feels kind of ephemeral, that people want to hold something that feels tangible. They want a print book. We see vinyl making a comeback as a part of this. So there definitely are these kind of signs that people are pushing back against this. Against this moment.